The Wind Waker is known for many things. Its seafaring exploration, charming characters and story, and overall bright, happy vibes. One thing that doesn't stand out as much though are the dungeons, which are somewhat tame compared to other Zelda games. They're not bad by any means, but they overall lack complexity or cleverness when stacked up against, say, Majora's Mask temples. Despite that, they all differ from each other and each have something to offer, so I think they're still worth discussing. This is FP Productions, and here's my personal ranking of every dungeon in Wind Waker. The Forsaken Fortress is unique in many ways. It takes 2 separate visits at different points in the story to complete, and each visit gives you a different type of experience. The first time through is a stealth mission where you're helpless against the weakest of enemies, and the second time it's a rush to the boss where you blaze through everything in your path. I appreciate this concept, but both visits to the fortress have issues. The first time through is very slow and can get repetitive if you're bad at stealth like I am. You have to creep along at a snail's pace to avoid being caught, and anytime the moblins do catch you, you're sent all the way back to your prison cell and have to try the whole thing again. It's also possible to miss your step and accidentally jump back down to the bottom floor, which means more backtracking. It would have been a lot better if there were multiple checkpoints along the way, so that even if you kept getting caught, you would still gradually make progress. But as it is, this part gets boring before long. The second time through has the opposite problem. Simply put, you're too strong. Aside from the Phantom Ganon fight, which is admittedly pretty fun, you can scale the tower with ease, cutting through moblins and mini-blins like they're paper. The dungeon layout is very simple, so there are no puzzles or traps to stop you either. This part would have been much more engaging if they'd gone further in changing the layout. Instead of just adding a few pegs to smash with your new hammer, they could have added some locked doors and really altered the rooms to create new puzzles. In the end, you're left with a dungeon that's too slow the first time and not challenging enough the second time, but a few tweaks could have made it really good. As your final test before getting the Master Sword, the Tower of the Gods rises from the depths with a grand cinematic cutscene. It's presented as a major trial that really gets you excited to see what's inside, but unfortunately I never found it to be all that impressive. It starts out strong at least. The first floor is flooded, and you have to ride your boat to get around. This stands out compared to the rest of the dungeons and gives it an impressive sense of scope. The individual rooms contain water-related challenges that involve the tide ebbing and flowing, which really sells the idea that this building is right in the middle of the ocean. It's a fascinating setting and had the potential to be an excellent water dungeon. As soon as you clear the first floor, however, it all goes away and becomes a generic tower. No more water, no more boat, just a bunch of samey looking rooms with similar challenges. Using the command melody to guide the statues through each room is pretty fun, but not enough to make the dungeon all that memorable. Progression is straightforward and it's always clear exactly where you're supposed to go. The Tower of the Gods has some really interesting ideas, but it could have gone so much further. As the proper first dungeon, Dragon Roost Cavern is pretty straightforward. Like the previous two on this list, you're never really in danger of getting lost, and puzzles are only small ones contained to a specific room, but this one is more forgivable for how early in the game it is. I also find the setting and layout to be more interesting. Instead of a generic tower, you're inside an active volcano, and occasionally on the cliffs outside it. This is also one of the few times you encounter an NPC in the dungeon with you. About halfway through you rescue Medley, who gives you the grappling hook. On a story level, I really like that Medley went ahead of you and tried to get through the cavern herself. It's a nice touch that adds a bit to her character and the narrative. The grappling hook is also a really fun item that gets a chance to shine in this dungeon. But there's still not much to say. It's just a straightforward dungeon with a fun setting and item. In my N64 dungeon ranking, I put Ganons Castle low on the list for being straightforward and not presenting many new obstacles. Wind Waker's final dungeon follows the same beats, but does so a bit better. Like in Ocarina of Time, you start by going through a set of small gauntlets that echo earlier dungeons in the game. This time though, they end with a boss fight, and even though the bosses aren't any different from the first time, it's still pretty fun to take them on again. The next section is where Ganon's Tower really shines. You go through a set of rooms fighting Phantom Ganon and have to figure out that his sword points the way forward. It may not be a long section, but it has an eerie atmosphere and a puzzle that hasn't been used before. For the last section, just like in Ocarina of Time, you simply go up a long staircase and fight enemies, although this time you can take the strongest ones out in a single hit with your new light arrows. I'm not sure if that makes things better or worse, to be honest. On one hand, it makes things way easier, which can kill the sense of climax. On the other hand, it gives you a satisfying feeling of progression since the beginning of the game, and having the power to obliterate strong foes. Either way, the best parts of the dungeon are the first two, which are enough to get Ganon's Tower the middle slot of my ranking. The top 3 dungeons are where things start to get more interesting. The Forbidden Woods are a large tree filled with moving vines, baba buds, and forest-like enemies. This setting scored the dungeon a few points right off the bat, and it uses these elements well. In one room, vines sprout from the floor in a sort of maze, and it's actually a bit tricky to navigate. Other times, the vines block the way to the nuts you have to throw at the monsters blocking the next room. In general, the dungeon uses its environment effectively. The dungeon also finds ways to incorporate the Deku Leaf. In addition to gliding over gaps, you'll use it to create currents that push rafts or move objects that would otherwise be inaccessible. For such a simple item, the Deku Leaf actually has quite a few uses. The Forbidden Woods are also home to the Boomerang, a series staple, and find new ways for it to be used too. For the first time, it can target multiple objects in one toss, which gives it new puzzle and combat applications. Again, there's nothing too complex going on here, but I find the Forbidden Woods to be a pretty solid dungeon. I like its atmosphere, and it finds fun ways for its main items to be used. The Earth Temple, which doesn't really have anything to do with Earth at all, introduces the partner mechanic. Throughout the temple, you use the command melody to play as a Rito named Medley, which gives the dungeon unique opportunities compared to the rest of the game. Medley can fly, allowing her to reach otherwise inaccessible locations, and use her harp to reflect beams of light. These light beams turn enemies to stone, destroy barriers, and activate switches, so it's used frequently. Once you defeat the mini-boss and obtain the Mirror Shield, which has the same abilities as Medley's harp, the puzzle solving really takes off. You have to coordinate your light beams with hers, often deflecting them off your shield or vice versa. There's one large room where you have to set up a series of mirrors correctly and get a light beam to travel from one side of the room to the other, one of the most memorable puzzles in the game. I really enjoyed this aspect of the Earth Temple. Another main feature of the dungeon is its creepiness factor. Redeads, floor masters, and cursed skulls haunt the place, and the music is suitably unnerving. The endless gray walls get dull after a while, and it could have lived up to the name Earth Temple a lot better, but it still leaves an impression. That, the partner gimmick, and the clever light puzzles make it my second favorite dungeon in the game. The Wind Temple is, in my opinion, on a completely different league from any other dungeons in Wind Waker. It's long, confusing, and features gameplay specific to this part of the game, which is exactly how a Zelda dungeon should be. Instead of Medley, you play as a Korok called Makar, who plants seeds that turn into tree sprouts. These sprouts make treasure chests appear, unlock doors, and later on, serve as targets for the hookshot. All these abilities make for a memorable experience. Speaking of the hookshot, it's one of my favorite items in any Zelda game, and this is the dungeon where you obtain it in Wind Waker. Its main use is, as always, pretty straightforward, getting across gaps or to higher levels, but the Wind Temple finds one or two more creative uses. For example, if you use it while wearing the iron boots, you can topple large statues. The iron boots get other uses too, such as pressing down switches that launch you into the air, or letting you walk through strong gusts of wind. On top of all that, the dungeon is massive. It consists of several different floors, and all of them have many rooms. It's the only dungeon in Wind Waker that really makes me feel lost for a little while, and it's fun to figure out which way to go. Finally, the music is also pretty catchy compared to most dungeon themes. Instead of ambient background noise, it has a melody and a weird, unnerving bass line. All of this combines to create a fantastic dungeon, and I wish Wind Waker had more like it. Well, that sums up my thoughts on Wind Waker's dungeons. I hope you enjoyed watching, and stay tuned for my next video, which will cover Twilight Princess's dungeons. And of course, feel free to share your opinions in the comments. This is FP Productions, and I'll see you next time.